The thing with the UFO subject is it's been ridiculed and ridiculed for decades.
And would you put Luis Elizondo in that same category?
I put Luis Elizondo in the category that he's defined himself as, a counterintelligence officer. So they showed them a photo of an alien grey, and this shaman just went, "That's Makanwabu." The consensus in modern day physics is we live in a simulation of some form. As the UFO does what it does. It breaks all conventions, it breaks all rules of science. It tells you you haven't figured it out yet. We've broken the speed of light at incredible levels multiple times.
Jay Anderson is one of the leading UFO researchers. He has interviewed top scientists, military personnel, and intelligence officials.
They froze about 3 feet, 5 feet above the roof of my house. They're about basketball sized, which is weird. Jimmy Carter was going to become president of the United States. He said to George Bush Sr., who was running the CIA at the time, "I want access to all of the UFO information." And he said, "Absolutely not."
Wait, sorry, you're telling me the president couldn't even get access to this information?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter literally said this himself. The truth is that the US government, and especially its intelligence agency network, have been obsessed with this subject for decades.
So, Jay, thank you for joining us. So, Jay, first thing I'm going to say is that when I was telling people about this podcast, there were two main kind of reactions I got. The first reaction I got were people were genuinely curious. They hadn't heard of UFOs, UAPs. They hadn't heard of any of the congressional disclosures, and they were like, "Tell me more." The second and the more upsetting reaction I got were people were they were treating this as a joke, and they were kind of like, "Why are you even doing this? Are you going to have a podcast about unicorns? Are you going to have a podcast about the fairies at the bottom of the garden?" They were just like, "This is a joke. So can you give your greatest piece of evidence for why we should take UFOs and UAPs seriously?"
Well, I mean, that's a question a lot of people ask in terms of the greatest piece. And I wouldn't say there's a single greatest piece of evidence. It's more about the coalescing of evidence over time. And you've got a very wide history that goes beyond the invention of aeroplanes, beyond any sort of modern technology. Speaking of anomalies in the sky, the Roman centurions experienced flaming shields and swords that they wrote about when they were in battle. And there's a lot of different cases that go back all the way to the beginning of human history in terms of experiencing the unknown. So my position on this is I've never been definitive with what UFOs are. I'm open to the possibility that there are some pretty exotic explanations behind this.
Do UFOs and UAPs exist? That's a kind of...
I would say yeah, but again, it's a very weird spectrum of what is it that exists, because you've got, orb phenomena, and then you've got things that seem to be material craft that would be technological. So there's a definite kind of spectrum that moves from the technological and the nuts and bolts and things that seem to be actually spaceships or space vehicles of some form, which isn't outside of the norm, to things that are completely outside of the norm, in terms of anomalous events and stuff that appears in the sky that actually can't be readily categorized or defined.
I think a quote that sums it up is one from Barack Obama, where he was like, "There's things in the sky and we just don't know what they are." And then the discussion is, what are those things in the sky? You can't deny that there's things out there that fighter pilots have seen, that just civilians have seen, that reputable sources have seen and have said, we don't know what it is. But it's like, is it just a rare but natural occurring phenomena? Is it something that's been misreported, or is it something more unique than that?
Well, Obama's an interesting one. He's kind of, in my opinion, one of the more what they call read-in presidents in terms of being briefed on this subject and brought into the fold, because over I'd say 5 years or so, he's made comment after comment publicly, sometimes with a smile and a laugh, but he's talking about how this is a subject that they take seriously in government. And I think that he's actually quite soberly concerned with what it is that we are dealing with here. And there is definitely a cutoff in terms of the information flow within government. I mean, right now you've got the congressional hearings and you've got people in the Senate talking about this subject. They're getting their information from people within the intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, all of these different groups. And it's hard to know who to trust, but there's certainly something going on that's important enough to merit a discussion in the modern era. So it hasn't been, the thing with the UFO subject is it's been ridiculed and ridiculed for decades, going back to kind of like the Roswell years and what they call Project Blue Book. But actually what we're seeing now is that this hasn't gone away, and the governments have been taking it seriously, And despite the Hollywood trend that's been kind of injected into our brains for decades of little grey aliens and green men and spaceships, the truth is that the US government, and especially its intelligence agency network, have been obsessed with this subject for decades.
You mentioned Blue Book over there, and like in the past, whenever civilians would report UFOs, the government categorically said, no, there's nothing there, there's nothing anomalous. Why has there been such a vibe shift in like the past 5 to 10 years on this?
I mean, there's a few different potential reasons for that. I would kind of put my own position on this is that there was actually quite a significant grassroots civilian movement prior to 2017, which is when the New York Times put out a front page story about ATIP and the Pentagon program, and everything started kicking off and it went mainstream from there. But prior to that, there were actually some pretty significant players in the grassroots movement who were getting insider sources. They were bringing people to the stage. Someone like Dr. Stephen Greer, for example, who was essentially back in, I want to say it was the 90s at this point, he did the National Press Conference where he brought out literally about 50 different intelligence agency people who were associated with the UFO phenomena in some way. And so I think that this is actually, in my opinion, and this is an opinion that's changed over time from absolute support of what's going on to leaning back and being a bit more skeptical, especially because this conversation that started in 2017 is still going and it's very slowly churning, and we haven't really had a good degree of like solid, actionable intelligence or evidence. So I have a suspicion that this 2017 New York Times, officials getting involved, Congress getting involved, the Senate getting involved, is a way of slowing down a grassroots, more aggressive attempt to get into this subject, because people like Greer were looking at legal consequences for these, what they call unacknowledged special access programs, these deep programs in the kind of Pentagon's clandestine research and development areas, right? So these very secretive programs have existed for a long time. And there were people who wanted to bring this out, people who were actually getting very close. And then they kind of got kneecapped, they kind of got cut off. And this new thing took over, which, yes, the optics are impressive. We've got Navy pilots, we've got people in the Senate, we've got people in the Congress, but the rate of it, the rate of the actual explosive evidence or information, that slowed down.
Sorry, Jay, one question. What was the catalyst in 2017 to change everything?
So the catalyst was actually a New York Times story that was written by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, two New York Times journalists. One of them, well, actually both of them, had a previous history of interest in the UFO subject anyway, but they put out a front page article in the New York Times talking about a program that was in the Pentagon called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. And the supposed director of that program, Luis Elizondo, who came out, and he's a counterintelligence officer for the Department of Defense, he came out to the New York Times and said there's this program, that the Secretary of Defense was not being briefed on it, and this was the reason why he was coming out into the public, because he realized that the information about this program wasn't going up the chain of command, and he wanted to go public with it. And this program was all about UFO analysis and trying to understand the science and the technicalities behind these vehicles. So that's when the ball started rolling in terms of a mainstream conversation. Since then, you've had Navy pilots coming out on the mainstream media talking about what have now become quite famous cases, like the Nimitz case, which is the tic-tac shaped UFO that's been reported on all across the mainstream media. So there's been a revival. There's been a revival that's including the official channels and corridors of government. But we're in a very strange time geopolitically, and my personal opinion is trusting the kind of deeper levels of the intelligence national security state to handle this subject transparently with the public is unlikely.
And why would they hide this? What's the interest for the government hiding this kind of information if they know UAPs and UFOs, aliens, extraterrestrial exist?
There's a few reasons. I mean, there's a technological conversation to be had. If these really are advanced aerospace vehicles, then there's a national security imperative to study that stuff very secretly. If it's a breakthrough next generation propulsion system tapping into the quantum field, engineering gravity, you know, these might sound like science fiction concepts, but they were being studied in the 1950s quite rigorously. And actually, that's an interesting side note in of itself, just the anti-gravity, electrogravitics, field propulsion research that got shut down in the 50s and 60s when the Cold War occurred. So there's a technological imperative, definitely. There's also a, I would say, social, psychological issue at play. Can people deal with this truth? The old kind of, you know, they can't handle the truth adage. Can they? Can we deal with it? Religious consequences in terms of belief systems. And then there's always the possibility that they do not know what this is. And they aren't ready to tell us that they do not know what this is, because what kind of defense apparatus wants to admit they're defenseless, right?
You mentioned a little bit earlier there that a lot of this technology they were studying in the 1950s. So why do you think that this is necessarily like another non-human intelligence or something that we can't explain? Why couldn't this be secret programs within the US military, maybe the Chinese military, maybe the Russian military?
I think it absolutely could.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of that. Like I said, the UFO subject represents a pretty vast spectrum of different things. Essentially, it's just weird stuff in the sky we can't explain, right? So a lot of it can be explained because people just see something prosaic and they misidentify it, and, you know, that's not a UFO. But there are advanced aircraft. I mean, we know that anyway. Things like the SR-71 that was back in like the 60s or 70s that they invented that, and we still don't know what its ceiling is. We still don't know what its max speed is. So the idea that there is actually very classified aerospace technologies coming off of the back of things like Nikola Tesla's work, which was all taken by the FBI, if people didn't know that, when he died penniless and forgotten.
And married to a pigeon, apparently.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so apparently he married a
He was
pigeon.
in love with the pigeon.
Oh, in love,
In
yeah.
love, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was an eccentric man. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, there's no doubt in the man's brilliance. And the FBI raided his, his labs and took all of his stuff. And there's a few different notable cases around that time period and going forward, where T. Townsend Brown is another one. An inventor in terms of anti-gravity, and he was taken in by the US Air Force. So this is all around that kind of 40s, 50s, 60s period where this stuff was starting to bubble up to the surface. And actually, the consensus in physics at that time was that gravity was the next thing. It was literally the consensus in the kind of mainstream orthodox progression of physics and propulsion. Where are we going to go? Electrogravitics, manipulating gravity, manipulating the field, and then it all stopped.
Jay, what really sells it to me that this isn't something that's human. So these pilots, these kind of experts are seeing things in the sky and they can't explain it. And why do I go to it being non-man-made? Why do I go to it being extraterrestrial or intergalactic? Is that, let's say, and I think the Nimitz incident, when it was dropping down at a certain speed, is we haven't yet seen military tech like that. And if I was Russia and I had that spacecraft, or if I was China and I had that spacecraft, wouldn't we see it being used in the Ukraine war? Wouldn't we be seeing it used in Taiwan? We're not seeing any of this kind of tech, even close to it, being used on the military battleground. So therefore, it has to be something that's outside of it being man-made.
Do you see the B-2 bomber being used?
I
Not
think
typically, right?
We've seen the B-2 bomber used, and if we look at the Russia situation, they want to take over Ukraine. It's not going their way. This would be the perfect excuse to try these fun, tools they had. When the US used nuclear weapons in World War II, they didn't have to use it, but they thought, if I use it now, it'll be a threat to everybody else, and it will it'll show people that I'm the world superpower. If I was Putin or Xi Jinping and I had these kind of tech, I would use it to show people, look what I can do.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern, and it's a good point to bring up, but I think the biggest concern is that it's gone outside of government. It's not government anymore. It's transnational. It's aerospace, defense corporations,
military-industrial
contractors, military-industrial complex, but only tangentially attached to government and any sort of official proceedings. Like there are some cases that have come up, including one that is quite interesting, involving an admiral and a DoD physicist, a conversation that was leaked online, series of documents that came out of the estate of an Apollo 14 astronaut, Edgar Mitchell. And that details a conversation where this admiral had been denied access to certain programs, and their progression, according to him, was extremely slow. So the idea that they've reverse engineered alien vehicles and have perfected that technology, I have my doubts about that. But the idea that they have used field propulsion, electrogravitic propulsion, that seems a lot more likely. And how you reveal that is a different story, because you could be using those types of assets in space. You could be using those types of assets just as covert intelligence gathering platforms. They don't necessarily have to be going into the battle space and being aggressive elements. But the idea that they would have these things and not use them is a good one to bring up. And that's why I say it's more likely that this has gone into the deep black corporate, and it's barely even governmental at that point. And that's what that admiral who I was just mentioning said about. He said that it was essentially no government officials attached to these programs, just in a kind of liaison, and that's it. So it's probably not government, to be honest, at this point. It was once back in the 50s and 60s, and then it seems to have just gone over time. If you look back and you do your research and you look into the history, it seems like it's splintered off into these corporate
The privatization of alien craft.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
Jay, could you explain though, because a lot of people might hear anti-gravitics and field propulsion, they have no clue what that means.
Well, I mean, I'm not a physicist, but it's just the manipulation of gravity.
Okay.
It's technologies that instead of using a propellant like chemical combustion where fire's coming out of the back of the engine, you're talking about using the ambient field of energy around us, pulling from what they call the quantum vacuum, which is just the so-called empty space that surrounds us all the time. These are very exotic concepts, but they're not science fiction. It's just kind of breakthrough physics and hypotheses, at least according to mainstream physics. But if you start looking at the black world of classified projects, these are the things that they've been obsessed with for decades.
Jay, the skeptic in me, when I hear that these private military contractors like Boeing and Lockheed Martin have access to this reverse engineered craft, is like the whole idea of a company is to make profits for the shareholders. And so if there was a way to kind of take this tech and make it, commercially profitable, I don't know, like develop something that, customers can use and they can sell it, wouldn't they have done that already? Because their whole idea is let's make a buck. So they would use this kind of, and this tech that they have, and they would just create like a product that they can sell to like the public. And they haven't done that yet. So maybe it's because they don't have the tech.
Absolutely, could be because they don't have the tech. It could also be that the tech isn't actually very advantageous for profit, because free energy or quantum vacuum energy, like these very, again, novel, exotic ideas, but if they were put into global applications, you're essentially talking about a post-scarcity economy, a free energy society. That's not exactly the model that the people who are at the absolute threshold of power seem to want in this world. They want to have a dependency system. We're all filtered through that. So the idea that they would actually want to bring out very novel propulsion is actually quite unlikely. And also the former director of Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, which is the advanced programs area of the company, its most classified area, a guy called Ben Rich. There's multiple quotes attributed to him, one that was at a UCLA alumni speech, I want to say in 92, but don't fact check me on that. It could be slightly earlier or slightly later, where he said, we already have the ability to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit the public. Anything that you see and have seen on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. That's coming from a director of the most advanced, most classified aspect of what is essentially the spearhead of the defense contractor world, Lockheed Martin. And I've had other people who won't go on record with their names, who were aerospace engineers for Lockheed Martin, that have kind of given inclinations that they do have very, very advanced technologies that would completely defy what we understand as conventional or expecting. But this is the situation, this is a very classified, clandestine area of development. The idea that it would leak out into the public, it's very, very hard to find valid, actionable intelligence, but the history of the science, the history of the progression of their interest in UFO technology, which seems to kind of hint at this type of gravity manipulation and influence, it becomes obvious that they consider it important. There's something here. There's something to be looked at.
Jay, when I hear all of that, it gets me a little bit concerned, because we're talking about electrogravitics, we're talking about this super advanced technology. Kiel mentioned the Nimitz, where it dropped almost 30,000 feet in literally a second. If this is controlled by private military contractors as opposed to the government, are they not more powerful than the government? And if, let's say, Congress comes, and we've had a few hearings now, they decide we want to actually bring this technology forward and use it for the benefit of humanity, they might be like, no, and they actually have the power to say no as well. So,
well, I mean, we hear a lot about the deep state these days, kind of, an unelected nexus of officials and career bureaucrats and kingmakers who sit in the background and do all of the dirty deeds, right? That's a real issue. Whether or not you believe in a literal deep state, you can certainly believe in the entrenched corruption of modern politics. So yeah, it's a difficult one to try and get your head around in that regard. But at the same time, I kind of come from the position that the government is actually quite ignorant to a lot of this. They don't really understand what it goes. I mean, people think of the government as some sort of massive structure of control and influence that has its hands in everything, but it's actually very chaotic, and it doesn't seem to have much of a communication between different agencies. They get blocked out from different programs and research. So to trust the government to be able to handle this in an appropriate way seems unlikely to me. And I don't think that they're really that knowledgeable on what's happened. There has been a splinter, in my opinion, 30, 40 years ago during the Cold War.
Jay, my next question is, okay, cool. We've come to a conclusion that there are these things in the sky. And, there's theories that they're either kind of military crafts from other countries. They could be kind of, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. Who do you think are flying these crafts? Like, what are the theories that are out there, and which do you think has the most credence to it?
Kind of weirdly, I want to say the most prosaic and the least as my two categories. I think that this is human technology that's extremely advanced, that they're just using the alien narrative as a cover for, which they did anyway they even admitted that back in the 60s and 70s when they were flying the SR-71 out of Groom Lake, Area 51, all of these classified spy platforms. They even admitted later on that the UFO subject was a very convenient cover because it allowed them to...
So you think there's no kind of aliens that visited
I didn't say that.
Okay.
So I think that it's, they think it's a very convenient cover to allow classified aerospace platforms to fly with impunity, because if you see some weird shaped vehicle that you've never seen before, you're just going to go, well, my God, that must be a UFO. It's very convenient. I think outside of that, there is actually what we could call an interdimensional or higher dimensional aspect to this.
Wait, sorry, you have to explain what is interdimensional.
Well, exactly. No one really knows. Something from beyond the veil of our ability to understand space-time. Something beyond our rules and principles and laws of physics, you know?
From another solar system, or
No, I mean, potentially, but if you're talking about something from an entirely different dimension, we could be dealing with four-dimensional beings, you know, something that exists beyond space and time, which is very hard for a layman to wrap their head around, but a quantum physicist would love that. You know, the idea that there are things that exist outside of this construct of space-time, linear space-time.
Sounds like ghosts to me.
Yeah,
Sounds
well,
like Jin's ghosts.
These things are all wrapped up into one. I mean, the thing is, people need to understand is that when it comes to physics in general, we're changing our models, we're changing our idea of what reality is. You know, we're moving out of what we would call a material reductionist, atomist, Newtonian model of physics into the quantum physics realm because of our computation, because of AI, our ability to simulate, and our ability, for example, with things like CERN, to smash particles together and understand what's going on. The consensus in modern day physics is we live in a simulation of some form. You know, that this is all essentially just energy vibrating so fast it creates the illusion of solidity.
So the two main theories I hear is that it's either extraterrestrial or interdimensional. And by extraterrestrial, it's an alien civilization that was sort of born way before humans, and it's developed more advanced tech and has come to visit us. Or interdimensional kind of alludes to the point that you've made, that it's kind of some being that lives on a fourth or a fifth or a sixth dimensional that's interacting with us. I've also heard some theories about it's potentially us from a future timeline that have traveled to the past to, I don't know, do some butterfly effect and change some timeline towards the future. Are any of those? Is there any truth to any of those?
Well, again, I think all of them should be entertained in the absence of definitive knowledge, right? We don't know what's really going on, so everything's on the table until we have to take it off. And there's also crypto-terrestrials, if anyone's ever heard of that. That's
what even is that?
Yeah,
is
I know,
Bitcoin
right?
Is like an alien form? I don't get the crypto.
Yeah, they're really into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
They're
just here to mine us.
Crypto, or I think also there's a term that's the same, ultra-terrestrial, which
yeah.
is that they were always here. That
John Keel, I think
they've always been on this planet. They may even be, older than us in terms of being on this planet, and that's actually what Tom DeLonge believes in terms of the Blink-182 rock star who went on to found To the Stars Academy. If anyone's ever heard of that story, it's pretty wild because 2017 might have been when everything kicked off, but it all kicked off because of a Blink-182 rock star who decided to go to the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and start asking questions and get the ball rolling. So that's kind of an interesting bit of this, is that Tom DeLonge was the guy that actually started this conversation in its official capacities, but he basically seemed to come out of the meetings with the DOD and the Pentagon and went on the Joe Rogan Experience and was like, the Greek gods are real, and they've been interfacing with us throughout history, and they are responsible for us being on this planet. And you go back, and this is obviously this is kind of going off the deep end slightly, but we can reel it in. But if you just go back to things like the most ancient creation myths we have, which is ancient Sumerian creation myth, which is the Anunnaki, these gods that came down from the sky and essentially molded us out of the clay of the earth and breathed life into us as their slaves, unfortunately, at least by the translations that we have. And that's actually something that's echoed through a lot of the different intelligence people I've spoken to, people who have worked for the CIA and the DOD and these guys. They all seem to believe, or at least hold a lot of space for the ancient creation myths, which kind of gets into probably a deep end topic, which is, were we in some way engineered as a species?
Genetically engineered. That's super interesting. Do you think there is any credence to that? Or
I mean, there's, we still have this huge block in terms of how did our cranial brain size increase in such a rapidly short evolutionary time span in comparison to everything else. We are absolutely novel. We are a completely novel intelligence on this planet. Nothing's doing what we're doing. Nothing. And we work outside of equilibrium with the planet, which is interesting. If we're a natural expression of this Earth, you'd think we'd find equilibrium, we'd find balance, but we don't. We pollute, we tear up, we destroy, we cannibalize. And it makes me wonder. I mean, I'm certainly not saying it's the truth, but it does make me wonder.
That's a rosy brochure for planet Earth.
Do we belong
we
here?
Cannibalize.
Yeah.
Jay, the second question I have is that it's not necessarily a binary. It doesn't have to be intergalactic or extraterrestrial. Could it be that all of them are visiting us and that it's more of a mix? And do you think that all these visits are by one being, or it could be kind of different beings?
Well, there's a very famous UFO researcher who's also a very well-known computer scientist, and he actually had a cameo in, I want to say it was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, French computer scientist Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée's opinion, kind of in tandem with the psychiatrist Carl Jung, was that there is some form of overarching intellect that can represent itself in different forms. And so the UFO, the orb, the ghost, whatever any anomaly, it might all be coming from one definitive source that's just simply able to express itself in a myriad of ways. Again, these are just ideas. We don't have definitives. I kind of keep myself open to the idea that, well, it's a very, very big universe. The idea that there could be spacefaring civilizations, likely. I'll hold space for that. Well, quantum physics and quantum models are starting to look at reality in a way that's completely different, saying it's almost computational and simulation-like. All right, I'll hold space for something that could be able to come through that simulation, what we might call higher dimensional, from another aspect of reality, piercing through the veil into ours. And then obviously just clandestine, classified, black budget research, which we know from any sector. Pick your sector of innovation and development and look at the history of it being held back and classified in different ways. If it's strategic, if it's something very important. So that's not a baseless claim. We have evidence for that. So yeah, it's not for me about being able to sit here and be like, here are the answers. For me, it's going, I have only got questions, but they're worthwhile, and you should take it seriously, and you should consider the fact that this has actually been going on for a very long time. And that, in essence, the government speaking about it now is just permission to be able to be curious about this subject now. I mean, I've spoken to so many academics, people who would never have spoken about this subject before, triple PhDs, world-renowned authors, people who weren't into it, who have switched over to being interested.
Richard Dolan.
Richard Dolan's been in the game for a long time, but it's a funny one because I don't necessarily trust the governmental process, but I do appreciate the template it's given us, because we can say to people, well, did you know that in Congress and in the Senate, and here's the US Navy pilot. So it's given a template for the average person who didn't know about this stuff.
It's given authority to the subject that wasn't there before.
It has, but is it truthful? Is it the narrative we should be listening to?
Because they're not discussing unicorns in the same way. They're not discussing Santa Claus in the same way they're discussing UFOs, which puts it on a different level to how it was perceived differently as just another myth. Like
also, the concept of a man flying through the sky and giving presents to people and the concept of advanced technology from another species should not be on the same level. I mean, this is, we live in a potentially infinite universe.
It was treated for a while as in the same...
Oh, for sure. But I'm just saying, to everyone listening, it doesn't really make sense to equate the tooth fairy and Santa Claus to UFOs, because I think another issue with the UFO subject is it has been purposefully saturated with disinformation from both the intelligence community and from just grifters, people that just want to make money and go to the conferences and say that they're speaking to people when they're not really speaking to people. And that's been happening for decades.
And would you put Luis Elizondo in that same category?
I put Luis Elizondo in the category that he's defined himself as, a counterintelligence officer. And the remit of a counterintelligence officer is to disrupt a group cohesion in, any way that's actionable for what they're trying to achieve. And he actually said that he was asked in 2000, I can't remember the year now, but this is a direct quote where he said, I was asked in, I want to say
we can clip it in
2008. It might have been even that early, but it might not have been that early. He was asked to apply his counter skill set to the UFO community, and that's what he did. I was never a UFO guy. I was never a UFO researcher guy. I was a counterintelligence, counter-espionage, counter-terrorism guy. And they asked me to bring that skill set to the UFO community.
And do you think David Grush, David Fravor, they're part of the same cabal? Or
it's not a cabal, man. You got to understand that there is a group of people in the government who've been obsessed with this subject for decades. It started off with people in what they called NIDS, the National Institute of Discovery Science, which was set up by a rich hotel magnate called Robert Bigelow.
Yeah.
And, this is back in the day, and they were interested in a place called Skinwalker Ranch, which a lot of people have heard of because there's a TV series about that now. There is a group of people, they've called themselves the Aviary, they've called themselves the Sacerdotal Knights of National Security. They are people who are very interested in the UFO subject. They view it in a quasi-mystical way, in terms of a belief system. And they have been aggressively pushing this through the Pentagon and through the DoD for a number of years, and now they're out in the public doing it. And there are people who are a part of the intelligence community who don't trust these guys, who've said that they have been in the background doing this, kind of pulling scams or pushing false evidence because they believe in it so much that they're willing to falsify evidence to push it out into the public sphere. And there have been a lot of contradictions and red flags and issues with this official 2017 narrative. Luis Elizondo no longer refers to himself as the director of ATIP. There have been issues in terms of what he really was in relationship to that program. That's the Pentagon program the New York Times talked about. So for me, like when I first got into this, I was extremely wide-eyed, and I got interviews with Lou and a lot of these people. And over time, just with the way in which I've seen behavior and the way in which I've seen contradictory information and bad evidence being put out there, I start to feel like it's more about covering up the subject in quite a clever way by getting people to just essentially be tired of it. Because even though there is a congressional conversation, we could probably bump into anyone on the streets in London right now and no one's heard of it, right?
And
no one's actually heard of it.
And I think the congressional discussions are talking about more the transparency behind it and it being hidden and who's hiding it as opposed to the actual subject. More people are kind of adding fuel to the fire of this is being hidden from them than what is being hidden from them. And they're talking more about kind of the skiffs and the classified and the black box and less about what is it that they're hiding. And I think that's probably some kind of hiding within the conversation.
I think what's frustrating a lot of the congressmen is that they're getting promises of, I'll tell you more in a skiff. And for people that don't know, that's a secure compartmented information facility. It's essentially like an underground Faraday cage where no electronic signals can enter or exit. So it's a classified discussion room, basically. And a lot of these guys, Lou included, have promised to, I'll say more in a skiff, or I can say more in a private session or a closed session. And some of these people are coming out, congressmen, congresswomen, saying they're refusing to actually do that. So this is why I'm like, well, what's happening here? Is this just lip service? Is just like a bit of a wild goose chase where they send these congresswomen and congressmen running around looking for programs that don't actually exist, when programs do exist, but not these ones. That's my suspicion.
Who are the most pro-transparency Congress people? I've read a lot about Senator Harry Reid, who pushed quite a lot. But today, if we're looking at Congress or we're looking at the Senate, who are the most pro-transparency?
Nancy Mace, Tim Burchett, who I've had on a number of times for interviews. He's very involved. Senator Gillibrand, Marco Rubio. There's a few. There's a few who are interested, and it's grown over time. But even they are getting tired now of a very cyclical process. It's like, yes, we have had congressional hearings where these guys are sitting down under oath, but not much is coming from this. 2017 was a long time ago. If we're talking about any sort of rapid disclosure, especially in the face of all the other things that are going on in the world, where it's like, guys, we don't really have much time to sort this stuff out. It feels like we need to really be, getting these critical pieces of information out for people to understand now. It's taking a glacial pace. It's that slow-moving turn of bureaucracy, and it's leaving a bad taste in people's mouths at this point, including myself.
UFOs aren't the only thing out of this world, so are our conversations. If you guys are enjoying this podcast with Jay, please like, subscribe, and follow us across our social media channels. It's your support that really helps us bring on amazing guests like Jay and have more conversations like this. Thanks so much, and back to the podcast.
Jay, I'm going to bring you back to aliens because I've got some burning questions I want to ask you. And one of them is, if what's behind this UFO is interdimensional, extraterrestrial, it's an intelligent species of sort that isn't human, is it violent or is it peaceful?
Well, I think that, you always have to, again, hold space for the possibility that there's a malevolent or combative intelligence out there. If we were ever to be encountering a more advanced civilization than ourselves, you better hope that they're peaceful. I think that there is probably a certain level of progression once you hit the ability to travel beyond the speed of light, once you can fold dimensions and go through wormholes or things like this, if we're talking about that level of highly advanced technology.
But what leads us to believe that?
Would you be fighting and bickering amongst yourselves?
We're still bickering. We've had nuclear weapons. We're still bickering. The more we've technologically progressed as a civilization, as a society, that hasn't reduced the amount of disputes we have.
But nuclear weapons are nothing in comparison.
But it's a progression to sticks and stones. We were fighting with sticks and stones were around. We've had nuclear weapons. We're still fighting. I think if you add in the speed of light, we're still going to fight. I think technological progress and cultural progress are separate. And I don't think they're kind of aligned in any way.
Well, this might be one of the concerns that's stimulating the secrecy. Are we ready to handle technologies like point-to-point travel? Probably not. I mean, you could take a rogue element, a terrorist group, or some bad actor who wants to use that technology. They could destroy the entire planet. This is way above nuclear weaponry. If we're talking about actually drawing energy from what is essentially the infinite vacuum of quantum energy in the field surrounding us, then you're essentially dealing with planet destroyers, like atomizers, So if there is a civilization out there that has that type of ability, I'd like to think that they've matured beyond petty squabbles amongst themselves. Whether or not that would translate to them having any sympathy for the planet they're coming towards, that's a different story. So yeah, and to answer your question, I think it's a big, big universe, man.
And what does the evidence say? I've heard of abductions, and the thing with abductions is some people say they were benevolent, they were quite peaceful, they wanted to just investigate, and actually they told them a moral story, which is kind of like from the Bible, that you should look after the universe, you should look after the earth. And I've heard others that are a lot more malevolent, like they've abducted them and then they've kidnapped them and abused them and sent them back. And I think there's a story from Brazil where there was a UFO in Brazil and it was shooting lasers at people, and they actually went to the doctors, and there was evidence of these burn marks, and it was similar to chemical radiation. So we've got these conflicting abduction kind of UFO stories. Which do you give more credence to?
Well, again, I give more credence to the abilities of counter-information and disinformation campaigns run by the intelligence community. So, like things like Colares, Brazil, yeah, there were heat signatures, there were anomalous fires, no photos of UFOs though. But we have directed energy weapon technology, so we have the ability to simulate that kind of stuff from a distance and make it seem like, that fire just started out of nowhere. No, that's not even controversial, by the way. We just have that technology in terms of directed energy weapons. So yeah, the malevolent interactions, the abductions, man, the UFO subject is so strange, and the abduction situation is almost like a psychedelic experience. If you're not ready, you might have a negative feeling, and then a lot of the times the people I've spoken to that originally did see it negatively, upon reflection many years later actually see it as a growing thing, an extremely important event in their life. And that's similar in a way to a spiritual or psychedelic experience where you encounter things that are so beyond the norm that your initial reaction is to just be terrified, and then later you go, actually that really grew me as a person. So I don't know if there are malevolent abduction experiences. I've never been abducted, so I can't speak on that personally. But there are people that claim to be traumatized.
That reminds me of a story of the Prophet Muhammad, and when he first saw the angel Gabriel, it was a terrifying experience for him. But upon reflection, he realized that an honor was being bestowed upon him to spread the religion.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
That's throughout history.
I wouldn't say that there isn't malevolent intelligences or forces. There very well could be. My experiences were very positive, but people have got a very different take on this phenomenon when they've had those types of so-called abductions. It also leads in, by the way, just for anyone interested, it does also lead in again to the idea that the military might be simulating some of this stuff to create a narrative, to create this alien narrative, to kind of keep it very enforced. They might simulate what people would believe to be a UFO experience using novel technology, using disguises. This isn't outside of the normal for the intelligence community, especially the CIA.
Yeah, just to build a little bit on what Akil was saying about how Prophet Muhammad saw the angel Gabriel, I think throughout history, and Diana Pasalka really talks about this in her book.
She's brilliant, yeah.
She's amazing, isn't it? There's a lot of these religious experiences that in modern terms can be seen sort of as the same thing as
Ezekiel.
Exactly, yeah. Ezekiel, Moses, the burning bush.
So many
Yeah.
instances.
So many like that. So what's the link between UFOs and religion? Is there a common thread?
Well, that's the thing, is that the deeper you go into the UFO subject, past just kind of like flying saucers and grey aliens, you inevitably end up in theological beliefs, spiritual beliefs, mystic practice, alchemical beliefs, secret societies, because the same phenomena that's reported throughout time through these channels of theology and secret orders and the kind of the ancient mystic revelations of sages and priests. This is the same stuff that's happening to people now, except they're claiming it happened with a UFO. There are stories. There was a very interesting story actually from do you know what a gaucho is? It's like a Mexican cowboy.
And, I thought it was a restaurant.
There might be a restaurant called Gaucho in LA or something.
Yeah. No, I think it's in London.
El Gaucho. But no, there's a really interesting documentary. I can't remember the name of it now, but it followed the life of this Gaucho, this Mexican cowboy, just out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't have any sort of connection to this stuff, and he had a UFO experience where this vehicle apparently landed down on the ground, very technological looking. It's all very nuts and bolts, except for the fact that his dead grandfather came out of it. And that's where you start going into this weird, bleed over between these things. And you will also hear from shamans. I mean, there was a fascinating podcast. I can't remember the name of it. It was very old and it didn't get many views, unfortunately. where these guys who were doing a podcast got these Amazonian shamans on, and they were like, tribesmen from the Amazonian basin, living out in the jungle, drinking the ayahuasca, very much in communion with nature, no connection to modern society. And they asked, well, before they got the photo out, they asked them, like, do you know what an alien is? Like, what do you think about aliens? And they were like, no idea what that means. They haven't got a term for it in their language. So they showed them a photo of an alien grey, and this shaman just went, that's Makanwabu. And they had a whole story about Makanwabu, this human that became an ant that lives underground, and it can take your soul, and you need to be a good shaman to bring that soul back. But the fact that they had this complex mythology around something, they didn't know the term alien. The moment they saw the archetypical grey, they were like, that is Makanwabu. That's something we have.
Are aliens ubiquitous throughout culture? So wherever you go, whether
Yes.
it's New Zealand, whether you go 1,000 years back into human civilization, are aliens, this UFO experience, is it ubiquitous?
At least the greys seem to be. I mean, there's cave art in Australia that goes back thousands of years with big bug eyes and wide heads, and this is shared through a lot of different cultures across the world. What they are, I don't know. I do think the greys are a thing. I do think they are. This is like the typical Hollywood image that I guess we're being taught to laugh at. It's an alien grey. Come on, we've seen that on Close Encounters. But there are cultural mythos attached to these things that go back thousands and thousands of years. So I don't know what they are, but I do think they are something.
Could it be potentially something in our subconscious from the savannah in Africa that was imprinted on us, and as we explored the globe, it kind of manifests itself in these different ways? So as opposed to it being kind of like an extraterrestrial thing, it's something that we developed in the savannah in Africa, and now, the Aboriginals have it where they are, the Native Americans have it, we kind of manifest in different religions.
Well, I mean, that kind of speaks to Carl Jung's idea of a collective overmind, like the idea that collectively we manifest these archetypes. And Carl Jung had very fascinating ideas about UFOs. He kind of saw them as a manifestation of the collective consciousness at that time as a form of stimulus to push us forward. Something that defies our understanding in order to kind of break the normal model and move on to a more evolved level, show them something that's just slightly ahead, kind of like the proverbial carrot on the stick, chasing us through evolution. And the UFO, whatever it really is, seems to haunt all of historical time. It's been with us the whole time, an anomaly in the sky that can't be explained, that seems to, in many people, precipitate a rise in spiritual revelation or a feeling of being exposed to something so grand and so great that it incorporates itself into religions, into belief systems. So, without saying what the UFO is, you can certainly say what the UFO does. The UFO does what it does. It breaks all conventions. It breaks all rules of science. It tells you haven't figured it out yet.
And a lot of what you said isn't unique to me in the sense that in our religion, Islam,
There's lots of mention in Islam.
Exactly, and we describe it as a jinn, but it's against somebody who we share the earth with. Yeah. So it's a being that we share the earth with them, and you kind of commented on that. So do you think the manifestations of the jinn in Islam or angels in other religions or demons and all sorts is this experience, and they're saying it in kind of religious terms or terms of that time?
Yeah, I think it could be all part of the same pantheon of different things, like what would you associate a bright, flaming orb in the sky with thousands of years ago? Well, it's a chariot of the gods or something. You don't have the vernacular that we have now where you could be like, well, that's probably some sort of spaceship or advanced technology. So the cultural lens of the time dictates how it's viewed. But the interesting thing, I suppose, is that regardless of the fact that it seems to have shifted and changed in terms of how it's seen perceptually and culturally as we've evolved and changed as a society, the actual implications of it have remained the same. Again, an invocation of mystery, an invocation of like, what is this? And it kind of seems to push us down this very strange road of curiosity. When you have an experience that completely defies your logical explanation and expectations for reality, I think it can either do one or two things to you. It can break your head a little bit and you don't want to know about it and you just ignore it for the rest of your life, or it sends you down a journey to try and understand it. Personally, that's what happened to me.
Jay, there's a discussion, and it's one that is it our interpretation of these kind of beings, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, and we're putting our kind of subconscious on them and interpreting them as angels because of the culture and our time? Or is it them themselves transforming to guide us to a certain path? So back in the kind of, back in Jesus Christ's time, we needed kind of a moral revelation. So they kind of presented themselves as angels and were providing him with moral revelations. But now that kind of we're in a technological time, they're presenting themselves as spacecraft or anti-gravitational propulsion kits to kind of guide us towards that technology. technology? Do you think there's any? Which do you think has more kind of evidence for?
Well, I think there is the idea that there is some sort of ever shifting with the perception of the time phenomena that's following us in some way, and is it pushing us towards a certain goal? I mean, it's possible, absolutely, but the changing of form is interesting, and it's not just in the ancient times that the beings and deities apparently appeared. It hasn't just changed to so-called flying saucers or orbs. There's a very famous case, a guy called Chris Bledsoe, who's become quite well written about now. Whether or not you believe his story, he certainly caught the attention of the intelligence community when he started coming out about what he had experienced. NASA, CIA, DOD, Luis Elizondo, he got involved. This is, before anyone really knew about it. But Chris Bledsoe, he had and this is a guy living out in the middle of America in the West, I believe, and he had an experience with what he describes as an angelic being, a woman with blonde hair and a white dress hovering slightly above the ground with an aura around her, very typical angelic sort of phenomena. So is that UFO phenomena? Is that part of the whole thing? Because this guy also experienced orbs of light going around his house, so it's very difficult to know if it's just something that shifts and changes with time, or if it's a new phenomena, or if it's something else. There are no answers to these things, unfortunately, not yet.
And all this is based upon personal testimony. And people telling us. So have you had personal experience, and can you share it with us?
I have had personal experiences, but it's quite a long one. I mean, I'm happy to tell you the story, but because I wasn't a UFO guy, I wasn't a UFO researcher my whole life. I've always been a daydreamer and a creative thinker, but these subjects just weren't in my wheelhouse. I was a rock climbing instructor early on in my life, and that's kind of where my direction was going at that time. But I always had an interest in alternative subjects, just in, casually looking at things online. I started getting into a research area that kind of led towards UFOs, and the reason that happened is because of a series of books. Funnily enough, I was going through a really bad time at the end of university in London. And just a lot of things going on in my life at that time, personal relationships breaking down, things that just weren't happening the way I wanted them to happen. So I was in a depression, and my dad was worried about me, and he said, "Look, I'm going to be in France over the next couple of weeks. Do you want to come and stay out there with me and just kind of detox, get your head straight again?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So I went out to France and stayed with my dad, and he was like, "Look, I've got these books. I've got them on audiobook, and I really think you should listen to them. They'll do you a lot of good." And I was like,
kind of good it was in France with the Cometa report, and more transparent
exactly.
about UFOs in other countries.
There's a lot of connotations with UFOs in France. In fact, the French government have been more open than most in terms of what they've been trying to do. But yeah, he recommended this audiobook. It's a series of books called Conversations with God by a guy called Neil Donald Walsh. And at the time I was very resistant to the idea that a book was going to do anything to me other than bore me, and wasn't going to change my feelings about how I was at that time. And I didn't really have a belief in God. But these books were very interesting. It's a man who was homeless for a long time, who ended up having what he believes to be a conversation with God that he essentially wrote down over the course of a couple of years in a question answer format. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to just believe that someone actually had a conversation with God, but the answers were profound, they really were, and they seemed to speak very clearly to what I was going through. So it was a very important series of books that kind of activated that idea of maybe God, or what we think of as God, isn't like a deity. It's the universe. It's consciousness itself. It's everything. It's all things. Right?
I think that's a pantheist belief. I think Einstein shared it as well.
Animism, everything's conscious, right? And there may be a sum total, a source of that, like a core, but it's all just the same thing. That's what these books introduced to me. It sent me down these avenues of research, right? So that's where it first started. I first started looking into alternative ideas around consciousness, philosophies, quantum science, remote viewing. I stumbled into the CIA's Freedom of Information Act library a few years back and found out that they had 20, 30, 40 years worth of study in psychic spying, which is remote viewing, using meditative techniques, entering into a state of non-local consciousness and intuiting information.
And do you think that's true?
It is real. It is real.
And my next question would be, what's the evidence for this? Because I read the same things, and to me it seemed pretty dubious.
I would say the evidence is probably the fact that there were 30 years of study, about $50 million spent at the time, which was a lot of money in the 50s and 60s, and the fact that it didn't just stop with the CIA and the US Air Force, but it also went on into something called Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, which is a major defense think tank for the US government. And they took it very seriously. And they actually had some conclusionary reports saying that although the ability to do this is not definitive, it's not a sure thing each time, there is certainly evidence to suggest that this is possible, that this is doable, actionable, that we can get information in this format. And again, this goes into a longer conversation about quantum mechanics and what we really are as biological creatures, because the sciences are starting to get there, that we are just energetic beings, that we're in an energetic reality, and energy, just like a phone can send a text across the world, your thoughts can also move through those mediums of energy. It's just that we're very shut off to that. But this does tie into my own experiences.
Yeah, so was it remote viewing that kind of made you more...
Essentially, in a way, you could call it remote viewing. But I was researching remote viewing. I was researching all these different consciousness subjects. And then eventually I found myself in what I would kind of categorize as another depression. This time it was because I actually felt like I've got all of this information, like I've dived down all these different rabbit holes, and I have a lot of esoteric knowledge that I think is probably important, but none of it's helping me. Still got to pay my bills, still stressed about the next day, you know, like, what's this all for? And I remember sitting on my bed one night in 2019, and I just said out loud to the universe, like, I need something. I need something that represents all these things that I'm learning, all this stuff that I've been building up. I believe it, I do, but I really want to have evidence for it. Give me something, please. Like, just give me something. About a week later, my best friend was like, hey, you need to check out this documentary. It's called Unacknowledged, by this guy called Dr. Stephen Greer. And this is before I was a UFO guy, so I'd never heard of Dr. Stephen Greer, who is a very famous UFO researcher, and Unacknowledged is his big, big documentary. So we watched that documentary, and it was opening me up to the UFO subject, some, you know, very important, serious people, missile men launch officers, ICBM guys, like, you know, serious American folks who were in the intelligence community saying that this has happened. And then at the end of that documentary is when he brings in this concept that you can actually initiate forms of communication, forms of contact with some of these intelligences through the medium of meditative consciousness. And at face value, that sounds like an absolutely ridiculous thing to claim, right? That you can make telepathic communication and have contact events. And trust me when I say that, that's how I would have viewed it if I hadn't a week previously been asking for a real actionable method of doing something that would prove these things I've been learning. And then suddenly here's a guy with an apparently actionable method of proving these things that I've been learning.
And did you
do it? For me, it was like a light bulb in my head. I started doing it every single night. I started going, and I wasn't a meditating practitioner. I'm not a yogi. I haven't, you know, disciplined myself in meditation, but I just started getting into these very basic, you know, in through the nose, out through the mouth, calm the brain, calm the thoughts, and just start from that position of stillness in my back garden at night.
And these are like breathing techniques.
Yeah, just, you know, just that very calm, breathe through the nose, through the mouth, get yourself calm, try and shut down the chattering mind that's constantly running. And when it got into those quiet spaces, I would start to just very coherently model my thoughts around the idea that I want something to turn up. So, I mean, you know, people might call this a prayer, like saying to the universe, like, show me, I want to see, I'm ready. You know, if there is something out there that can hear this, that can respond to this, I'm ready, I want to see you. You know, if you believe that consciousness is the fundamental force of all things, that love is the most important force in the universe, come and see me. You know, I wasn't trying to mess around with anything dark and malicious. I was really trying to bring those energies up into a very positive space, which people laugh away. But again, if you understand biophysics, you wouldn't, because you would understand that we're actually electrochemical beings and our emotions produce incredible amounts of energy in our electromagnetic
What was it
field.
that you experienced?
I experienced a lot of things, man.
Can you describe it?
Yeah,
or is
it starts off
beyond
lightly.
description?
It certainly started off lightly with things that could be considered. I mean, I've always watched the sky. I've always been someone who would lie down in the field and look up at the sky at night. Look, there's a satellite. So I'm not, you know, someone who was ignorant to what goes on in the night sky. I started seeing initially an influx of what you could call satellites. They certainly look like satellites. Just way more of them than I've ever seen in my life in one time. Like, we're talking, you know, 15 to 20 of them coming across in the space of 3 minutes from different areas of the sky. But like, why is it so busy? I mean, they're not moving in any weird way. They're just traversing like normal satellites, but there's a lot of them. So it was like that was the first initial hint that something might be going on. It was enough to at least keep me engaged because it felt like there was something going on. Then, and this is over the course of days, right? Days and weeks of going out, doing this stuff, seeing these lights, seeing these, like, you know, satellites in higher numbers. Then some of them would start to glow very brightly as they were traversing. So they'd be coming across the sky And for anyone who already knows about this stuff, I'm already aware of iridium flares, which you get from iridium satellites, where the sun reflects off the satellite and creates a flash. But you actually need to be out at very specific times for that. And people who are obsessed with these things, they kind of, wait, they have their camera ready for that, just that right traversal moment. I was getting these white orbs coming over like this, and then they would start to glow and flash and then recede back down. And this was happening 3, 4, 5 times with one of them as they were coming across. Not one flash, but flash, flash, flash.
Did any of them communicate with you?
Well, this is the thing, is that I was, at least in my mind, sending some form of confirmatory, like, is that you? Flash. I mean, is that a communication? It's rudimentary, but it certainly felt like there was some form of responsivity from whatever this flash, whatever this light phenomena was, and the thoughts that I was, at least in my mind, imagining I was projecting from me. And it really did feel like this was a step-by-step progression, because it started to kind of progress from there to fast-moving white objects that would flash and move in strange directions, curve upwards, and do directional changes that satellites can't do. It was all starting to become even weirder. It was like layering it on week by week.
What was the weirdest thing that you saw?
I had 4 experiences with orange orbs of light, including one time where they came and hovered about 3 feet above the roof of my house.
Did they do anything?
Blew my mind. But apart from that, no. Like, they didn't do anything in terms of a communication to me directly. But I was, again, outside in my back garden doing what had become my usual routine at this point. And this was in like August of 2019. It was quite warm. So I was out in the UK. Obviously, it's pretty cold in this place. You know that. And I was out in my back garden. It was a summer evening. And I was looking up at the sky, and I was doing what I'd been doing for a few weeks now, which was projecting my thoughts. And I saw a blur of orange light in the top left peripheral vision. I looked, and there were 3 of these circular orange balls in the sky, orbs, high up, flew across really fast, stopped instantly above my property, very high up, but literally went, zoop, froze. And then they started this weird movement. I could see them rotating around each other. Then I noticed that they were actually starting to descend down from the sky. And so they were coming, I was literally at the back of my garden looking towards my house, which is probably no more than, maybe just double this length
scared?
of this room. I was shocked. I wasn't scared. I was rooted in place though, like shocked, just staring at this thing. So many people say, like, why wouldn't you get your phone out? Like, dude, like you do not understand. When you are seeing something that literally does not make sense, you do not take your eyes off of it. At least from my experience, the idea of doing this and unlocking my phone and looking at the brightness, none of that was even entering my head. Very selfish, because you're just like, I just need to look at this. I just need to look at this. They came down. They were doing this weird rotating movement, very smooth, 3 of them, in this almost like fireflies, but they were quite big. And they froze about 3 feet, 5 feet above the roof of my house. They're about basketball sized, which is weird, because I could see them from quite a high altitude. So it makes me wonder if like they decreased in size as they were coming down. And from my perspective, I couldn't see that, because they shouldn't be that size if they were also visible, really visible in the sky. So something happened there. 3 feet above the roof of my house, one here, one here, one here, in like a loose triangle. They looked like, as a camera guy, there's an effect called bokeh, where you take a camera and you outfocus it and lights just become circles, right? It's quite a famous effect they use on highways at night, and it's just like different colored circles. They look like bokeh. They look like they didn't even look spherical or 3D. They look like circular, slightly transparent, slightly kind of like ghost-like orange lights, but they weren't giving any light onto the roof. There was no glow of light, and these were just made of light. So that's something that I've always wondered about. How can you see something that's producing light and there's no scattering of light onto the surfaces around it? It's a very strange phenomena, but this was the closest, and I had 3 other experiences with those orange orbs. That's not even the first one. It's just the closest and easiest to describe in a short period of time. The first one was a giant triangle of them in the sky, about 30 of them.
Jay, what would you say to people that have said that because you went through a dark sort of time and you were looking for this, it was your brain playing tricks on you? Because as you know, our brain is probably even crazier than UFOs and the things that it does when we're looking for things. And so what kind of proof would you give to anybody who's kind of like, this is just your brain that was playing tricks?
Fascinates me, man. Very well could be our brain. What does that mean? what does that mean? Like for me, it's less about saying like, oh no, they were aliens, they were some sort of alien probe. It's not, no, it's about that. It's like, I went out into my garden in a completely sober state, projected intentions mentally, and orbs showed up. That's all I've got for you. That's my story. How do you feel about it? That's where I am at. So like, yeah, I've considered that. Even the Buddhists would consider that a tulpa, a psychic projection, something that's actually occurring within the psychic space of your own perception. Maybe if someone else who was in the back garden next to me was here, they wouldn't have seen them. And it's quite possible. But I have taken friends out into fields at night after having my own experiences and going up to them like, guys, like, you wouldn't believe what I've been going through. And they've experienced things, not necessarily orange orbs, but they've seen flashes and strange things in the sky that even they can't explain. So I would say to people that even though I don't have evidence for my experiences, you certainly can go out and gather that evidence yourself, but be cautious.
Can this evidence be photographed and videoed, or is it something that's you can't?
No,
because Luis Elizondo in that book mentions orbs in his house, and we discussed earlier, he's a counterintelligence officer, and he discussed him and his family when he was investigating UFOs, seeing these green orbs in his house, and his family would see it and his neighbors would see it. And my first question to him was, why didn't you rig up your house with CCTV to catch these green orbs? And that didn't come to him. I've looked throughout that entire book. I've looked through podcasts. He never answers it. So my question to you would be, if you experienced this in your back garden, how come you've never just rigged up some CCTVs to capture footage of it?
There's two answers to that. One of them is that I am just not a rich man, so I don't have the ability to get like kind of 360 fisheye multi-spectrum cameras, which is what you want. You want something that's fixed, that's covering the entire sky, that's looking at multiple spectrums of visible light and infrared and ultraviolet. I just have my phone, and I have gone out and tried to do it in terms of like getting evidence. And this is where it gets into the stranger side of it, the more subtle side of it, because again, I was doing this in a process that requires meditative consciousness. Like, this is an element of this, and this is not woo-woo, this is not spiritual, this is not magical. In my opinion, this is biophysics. This is quantum mechanics and biophysics. It's just that we're just on the bleeding edge of understanding that in our modern world, so it still looks magical. It's not. It's not science. So my perspective on this is that I can't necessarily explain. Sorry, I've actually forgotten the question.
Oh, sorry, I'll say the question again. The question is, how come you don't record any of this?
Record it, right. Yeah. So, like, the reason why, personally, I was struggling to record it was because when I was out there getting into these states of consciousness and holding my phone up, I would start focusing way more on the phone, way more on why haven't they turned up yet? Come on, my arm's hurting. Like, all these, those are what we call, like, neural chatter, like default monkey mind neural chatter. That is pollutant to meditative consciousness, right? That takes you out of the meditative state. Now, I'm not saying you can't evidence this stuff. I'm just saying it's really hard. It's really hard because if you really are, which I think we are, if you're dealing with very subtle communication methods that involve kind of intention and precision of thought and precision of emotion and kind of like bringing these energies up, the idea of you being able to do that while simultaneously looking for your iPhone and waiting for these things to turn up, it's very difficult.
And do you think they're trying to communicate to us explicitly, or do you think it is subtle and it's for those who are on a higher level of consciousness? You only experienced this after you went through that period and after you kind of reached this high level of consciousness. Do you think the average Joe can experience this and can communicate with these orbs?
Probably not. I think that everyone has the ability, but not everyone's going to. And in my opinion, it almost felt like a baby steps learning program to advancing your consciousness. You know, you get to a certain state, something turns up and almost goes, well done. There you go, a bit of confirmation that something is going on. So I would say that not everyone is interested in that. So, you know, it'd be weird to expect everyone to be able to do these things because not everyone's interested in doing these things. I would say that whatever this intelligence is, it's obviously far more evolved than us on not just like a potentially technological level, but also on a conscious level. You could call that a spiritual level if you want to. That it's just waiting for us to reach that level. If you can, in a fleeting moment, because I am not, I'm not some ascended master, I'm just a normal guy. I just happen to be able to get into some very fleeting states of consciousness that seem to produce these results. I would never claim that I'm in that state all the time. I'm a very normal person. And that's why it actually inspired me. Because when I had these experiences, I was like, well, I'm just a normal guy. I'm just a normal person. If I can do this, surely everyone else can do this. And so I started going out into the middle of the forest near me where no neighbors were, putting a camera on a tree branch and just kind of going like, hello world, like I've had these experiences, this is what I think about them. And I started putting that online. And that was the inception of Project Unity, was, you know, these experiences lit a fire underneath me that I had to try and get some form of answer. Certainly don't feel like I've got answers. I feel like I've got more developed questions. But yeah, it it seems to change people when they have these experiences. In fact, when we were speaking on the phone, I said that I think that there was almost a level of neural plasticity, that something changes in the brain when you have an experience that's beyond the normal. And like I said before, it kind of invites you to either just lock yourself away and forget that you ever experienced that, or it sends you down the road of seeking and trying to find answers.
Jay, so before we cap off, we're going to have some quick fire question rounds.
Here we go.
Have aliens visited Earth?
Probably.
Do you think the intelligence behind UFOs makes contact with humans?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think abductions are real?
Yes.
Can and do these aliens disguise themselves as humans?
Also very likely.
Who is one person, dead or alive, that you wish you could speak to about this kind of experience?
Terence McKenna.
Ross Coulthard said that there's a UFO that's so big that they've had to build an entire facility over it. Which country do you think it's in?
No comment.
Which countries do you think are the most advanced in trying to reverse engineer these crafts?
This country in America.
The UK and the USA.
Russia. And potentially India.
Do you think...
Vimanas, man. Sanskrit, Vimanas. They had ancient stuff in their history.
So they got a bit of a head start.
Yeah, they got a bit of a head start on that. Straight up.
Do you think UFO tech has been used to change the past?
Interesting question, and I don't want to be definitive.
And is
What
that
would you
related?
lean towards?
Yeah.
No.
No.
Do you think there is a secret space program that has already reverse engineered these crafts?
Very likely.
Does humanity's future lie in higher dimensions as opposed to exploring the rest of the universe?
No, but our higher self comes from those dimensions. We're here to experience this one.
What's one amazing thing that an insider's told you that you haven't said on a previous podcast or YouTube?
That we've broken the speed of light at incredible levels multiple times. The speed of
And
light.
we're hiding that information?
Yeah.
And who broke it? The
can't
US? Well, you tell me no if it wasn't the US.
I can't tell you who said that.
No, as in which country broke it? As in,
The US.
and why are they hiding that information? If they're broken the speed of light.
Seems like a pretty important thing to hide.
No, but what gets me is there would be so many other revolutions you would have to have before. Remember, to get to even 0.01% of the speed of light will take God knows whatever. To get to the speed of light will take, I think, all the energy in the earth to get to that.
That's what we think, but that might not be necessarily the truth of the physics behind it. It's classified physics.
It's a gravity bubble, isn't
Like-
it? It's manipulating space-time.
Well, yeah,
as
like the
opposed to-
Alcubierre warp drive,
Yeah.
which is like a gravity bubble. But there's also, again, Ben Rich, former director of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, said that there was an error in the equations. There was an error in the equations, and we fixed the equations. We understand it now. We understand how to travel to the stars. So I think that there's actually maybe conventional physics sees it as we need the energy of the sun within a compact little reactor.
Yeah.
That might not be the truth.
So what's this? There's this theory that I read, and I think Jesse Michaels brought it up once in one of his documentaries, is that string theory was given to us as a dead end to physics, and there was this whole other branch of physics that's being hidden from us. Do you mind explaining that?
I mean, I don't know the deep intricacies of it, but that's certainly an idea that's put out there that things like string theory are misdirections in physics to produce, a false perception of what the actual physical laws are and how they can be manipulated and changed, which again would make sense if you were doing classified physics studies, that you're going to push out misdirection in physics. So,
and what's the reason behind this? Why misdirect us?
To maintain the kind of model of society we have now with the type of engineering we have now, because again, if we are really talking about quantum vacuum engineering, free energy, this is a paradigm changing type of innovation. This is not your simple, typewriter to the printing press. This is something of a complete different order of revolution. So letting that out uncontrolled would be probably seen as a very bad idea to them. Maybe it's happening in a very managed way.
How much control do you think they have? As in,
who's they?
Whoever is with this tech, wouldn't other groups, as in, to believe in this idea, you have to believe that there's some sort of global intelligence cabal, because wouldn't Russia, China be doing the same things, ending up with something similar, the same results, kind of like the nuclear program? And if they have a different approach, a more democratic one, they'll be sharing it and it would end up in the population's hand. So when I look at technological progress like nuclear weapons, the US got it, a few years later, the UK got it, and Russia got it, and China, and so forth. And so with this, I think it's kind of US exceptionalism to think that the US are the only ones with it. Because if Russia have it and China have it, they might take a different approach and might democratically...
And they're supposed to have had their own crashes. They're supposed to have had their own Roswells back in the day, So most superpowers have their own kind of Roswell stories.
And they're all keeping it secret.
Well, this is the thing, right? Like, who is it? Is it the governments? Is it something that's beyond the governments? Not necessarily a highly organized cabal, more so some dusty bureaucrats in defense contractor worlds that have got, like, you know, a couple of vehicles sitting in a hangar somewhere going like, they ain't ready. It doesn't have to be some sort of major operation of continuous suppression, more so that it's locked up, locked away, you know? Only
I like the way Chris Mellon describes it, where he's like, there isn't this kind of secret cabal, but rather it's bureaucrats being bureaucrats. And especially in the US, they treat information as chips and they're trading those chips. And so let's say the Air Force has like this UFO dossier. They're holding it until the Navy give them something.
Yeah.
And when you're treating information like chips, you just don't want to make your information transparent because you lost all your leverage if you want something from the Navy or you want something from the Pentagon or the Congress.
Well, again, that's what I was saying before about it's not just one big cohesive group, the government. It's a whole splinter of programs and offices and directorates and agencies, and they don't all communicate with each other. In fact, there's a very famous Freedom of Information Act released document that is from the CIA asking the FBI if they would give them their Nikola Tesla patents and papers, because the FBI took all of Nikola Tesla's work and the CIA had to come basically head bowed to the FBI going, can we please have access to some of your work? And they said no. When Jimmy Carter was going to become president of the United States, he said to George Bush Sr., who was running the CIA at the time, I want access to all of the UFO information. And he said, absolutely not.
Wait, sorry, you're telling me the president couldn't even get access to this information?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter literally said this himself. He said this. He said that he was seeking information on the UFO subject, and he went to George Bush Sr., who was the director of the CIA at that point, and George Bush Sr., in so many words, just told him to, you know, screw off, basically. You're not going to get anything from me.
Would anything have changed if Jimmy Carter continued to, because you're the president, you could do whatever you want, if he pushed for it, or do you think there's something higher?
The president's puppet. Puppet. It's not real power. It's the power of the lobbyists and the people around them. So the president is like a revolving door. Honestly, the ones who really know, people like John Podesta, I'm not a fan of him, but people like John Podesta, career bureaucrats.
He wrote the prologue to Leslie Keen's book.
Yeah. I don't trust him, but he's, you know, certainly someone who's involved. And like, you know, career bureaucrats, people who've been in the background for a long time, not the revolving door of the presidency. That to me is like, that's a temporary employee. They're not considered important enough to be given that type of information, you know. So that's why Jimmy Carter was basically told to go away.
Honestly, Jay, we've loved having this discussion with you. It's been so fascinating.
It's been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for enlightening us with all this information.
Do you want to plug your socials for anyone that wants to hear more and follow you?
If anyone wants to check me out, you can find me on YouTube on Project Unity. You can find me on X at The Project Unity. Outside of that, I'm really bad with social media because it just stresses me out. So YouTube and Twitter.
You're too busy finding orbs and stuff.
Yeah, YouTube and Twitter is where you can find me. I get a lot of different guests on, a lot of different interviews. I try and go above the bar in terms of the credibility of my guests. There's a lot of people in this field that are not credible, and you have to be very careful in vetting your sources. But I do my best, and I'm on a learning curve. I'm just a young man trying to figure these things out, and everyone's on the journey with me, essentially. So if you want to be on that journey, Project Unity, you can come check me out.
Guys, thank you for navigating the rabbit hole with Jay Anderson. Guys, if you enjoyed our podcast about UFOs, please follow and subscribe to us on your favorite social media channels.